first of all, the relationship with failure. I think the failure model that we're taught in school and university is extremely one-dimensional, and it's not how the real world works. The failures are the trophies that you put on your wall. You really need to see failure as an asset and not something that's holding you back.
Este,
Listen,
why do you do what you do?
I think I love learning new things. I like growing as a person. That sounds so typical, but it is true. And I think being in a startup is one of the most challenging things that you can, or challenging positions that you can put yourself into. I am very interested in biotech, medtech, health, but I'm also very interested in engineering and technology and innovation. And I think those things came together when I decided what I wanted to study. I actually wanted to be a doctor. I was so sure that I was going to be a heart surgeon when I was younger. But then I went to shadow at a hospital, and I realized that I'm actually more interested in the technology behind the healthcare than being a doctor itself. And I asked, what do I need to study to do this? And that's kind of how I became an engineer, with the idea of being a biomedical engineer. But I think on a deeper sense, I have a passion for equipping people with the ability to manage their health, both mental health and physical health. And I actually skew more towards the mental health and the cognitive and psychology part. But I think Biocode is kind of stepping into that medtech space. And I hope that one day it will bring me to more of the behavioral psychology, cognitive, mental health, technology.
That's your next startup.
Maybe, yes, hopefully, yeah.
Maybe just to chase that before we dive more into Biocode too. So obviously you're CEO of Biocode now, but you had this passion for biomedical engineering, technology supporting health. What other options did you have? Did you say no to other things to say yes to Biocode, or what was on your plate as options before you jumped into taking a nominal salary to create something from scratch, very ambiguous?
I think, obviously, I did my biomedical master's.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, I needed to decide what I was going to do with my life. I think I definitely considered corporate, to get a job in some kind of corporate, because I think you can learn a lot from putting yourself in a position where people already know what's going on. But then Resia, my co-supervisor, and who's also a founder of Biocode, she got funding for the concept of Biocode, basically. And I was sitting in her office, and she said, well, I got funding, we're starting a company, I don't have anyone to drive this. And I volunteered myself as tribute at that point. Because as tribute.
Put me on the altar.
Because I thought, well, I think I've always enjoyed learning by doing. And I thought that putting myself in a startup position when I know absolutely nothing about business, about being an entrepreneur, about medtech development, to be honest, because it's not really just about the technology, it's about everything around it. The biomedical medtech space is extremely complex to navigate.
All the regulatory things
that
no one tells you about when you're engineering.
Even the politics of healthcare and the integration of research in healthcare and of medical technology in healthcare, and how you enter a market in healthcare it's extremely complex, and I didn't know anything about it when I started. But I thought that I really like learning new things, and I thought that would be the fastest way. Just jump into the deep end, I guess. I would approach it differently now if I had a choice again, in terms of not being... I think when you come from an academic environment and you do a master's, then you have this mentality of being a bit of a lone wolf. You're doing your own research. It's you and your innovation or your research. And I had a propensity for not really asking for help and thinking I can do everything myself. So I would say one of the first biggest lessons that I learned when I started was, and I'm totally deviating from the question now, but it flows into it, was that you can't do it alone. You can't do everything. First of all, maybe your personality has some deficiencies that makes, causes you to, you have to actually get people in your team that fill those deficiencies. But also you don't know everything. You don't have all the time in the world. So the first year was really just figuring out what it is, who should I be to be able to make this work. And I wouldn't change that for the world. So I'm glad that I chose this option.
And what support system did you have around you to help with finding out who you are?
I'm very introspective. So I think a lot of it, I had to do things and figure out, okay, it doesn't work, and then figure out who I am in that way. But obviously we have the university that supported us in setting up the startup. We had the founders and Resia, who's a founder, and we worked very closely with each other. And I think working with people who are different than me and think differently than me and approach problems differently than me, it taught me a lot about myself. Because, for example, Resia and I are very different people, and we have the ability to complement each other amazingly, very effectively. But then we have to understand each other in terms of how we approach problems differently. So actually just by working with people where I had to learn how to work with them taught me a lot about who I am as a person and where I need to tweak the rigidity of my actions and my thought processes.
Did you and Resia have any intentional conversations in that direction, or did it just kind of happen accidentally? Like you're doing your own introspection, but did the two of you, even Anna-Mart and Simone, like, do you guys ever talk about our kind of soft skill differences, personality differences, preferences in certain things? Is that acknowledged openly, or is it just you doing the thinking?
No, it's definitely acknowledged openly, not on a daily basis. It's not really something we mull over all the time.
It shouldn't be all the time.
But actually, I think it was the second year of Biocode, we did a session, Strengths Finder. That was extremely insightful because it was a neutral place for everyone to kind of learn about everyone else. And I think just the concept of focusing on each person's strength, or the whole program is, I like the concept because it focuses on the positive. During that program, we figured out that we are all actually very compatible if we acknowledge the differences between us. So that was very insightful. Before that, I think Resia and I acknowledged we're both very, I think being in a startup full of women as well, we're all very perceptive of each other's emotions and who we are and things like that. And I think Resia and I both had a lot of space and time for each other. So every now and again, there would be times where, there won't be direct conflict, but there would be a feeling of tension of I want to do it this way, you want to do it that way. But we always resolved it in a very diplomatic way because we created that space to understand each other.
Who is part of the actual founding team? Maybe if you could walk us through who those individuals are and their background.
So Resia was the main founder and driver in the beginning. Her background is she's a physiologist. She's department head at Physiology. Her research background is in inflammatory diseases. She drove the concept of Biocode for inflammation-centered medical diagnostics because it tied in with her research. Then there is Willem Perold. He's at engineering faculty. He was the department head for electrical and electronic engineering, and he was actually the supervisor of the research group that I did my master's in. His background is, nano biosensor development and electronics. So they kind of, Resia and Willem Perold, they came together and collaborated on a few master's projects, and that's kind of how the research group started. And then there's Anna-Mart, who is an expert in cancer research. So she also she became part of the founding team because of the link between inflammation and cancer. And in the beginning, that was kind of a focal point for us as well. Then for the first year, I was the first and only employee. We obviously had very limited funding, but like I said, that year was figuring out what is it that we actually want to achieve through this business. Then
I remember you in those days because
Yeah.
you were a bit of like a deer in headlights sometimes, or
Yes.
drinking water out of a fire hydrant. It's like there's so much coming at you. It's like, how's it going, Este? It's like, things.
Yeah. That's actually something else. If we talk about what you learn in the process, is distilling down all of the complexities to the most actionable point. I also had to learn how to do that in the first year. But then we kind of had a few members coming in and out. And then in the beginning of 2022, Simone, who's now the COO, she messaged, she just got married, she needed to find a job, and she is one of those people, she's not going to sit at home and do nothing. So she was not in the mood to sit at home while she's waiting to find a job. So she messaged Resia, and she's like, can I intern at Biocode? Resia messaged me, and I was like, oh, what am I going to do with it? Like, what am I going to do with an intern right now? And she came like in the first 5 minutes of talking to her, I'm like, oh, we're keeping her. Then she came to work for months at 7 o'clock in the morning, stayed till 5 for the first 2 months for free. And then after that, nominal salary. And then she just grew very fast. And, you know, she's a big doer. She really executes. And where I can sometimes get caught up in like the complexity of things. She's that person that fills me in the way, like she distills it down to, okay, these are the tasks, and she likes to tick them off. So we make a very good team in that regard. So she is now the CEO of Biocode. We outsource a lot of the stuff that we do, because I just told Brandon that we kind of made a rule that if we employ someone, then their employment should bring in money. And we were, you know, in very R&D phase for the last few years. So we outsourced a lot of the R&D, or we worked part-time with the research groups, and we got people to help us part-time. We just got a third permanent employee will do the lab management and the microcloud testing for us. So that will be our group.
Okay. Before we get into the business stuff, I just want to understand some background information from a health perspective. So inflammation, as you mentioned it. What is it, and what happens when levels get too high?
So inflammation is a natural part of the body's immune response. It's good for you in certain aspects. If you have an infection, if you have an injury, then it's part of your body's way to help you heal. The problem is that the average modern person who lives a modern lifestyle lives a very inflammatory lifestyle, because the modern lifestyle is riddled with inflammatory triggers. And it's kind of ironic, because our global disease burden consists of diseases that are actually preventable. So
what are inflammatory triggers?
Well, almost everything we do every day. No, that's maybe an exaggeration. The stuff we eat, the amount we stress.
Overly filled with sugar.
That's a big
preservatives.
One. Yes, processed. Yeah. We don't exercise as much. You know, we actually live a very sedentary lifestyle in comparison to prehistoric people. You know, people lived even like a few hundred years ago. Pollution in the air and everything we consume. Obviously, things like drinking and smoking also exacerbates inflammation. These days, you have to consciously deviate from the norm to be able to be healthy. Because at the moment, and I'm so sick of the stats, but it is a very important stat, more than 70% of deaths worldwide at the moment are caused by these inflammation-linked non-communicable diseases. And
if you could give us some tips on basically how individuals could reduce the inflammation and keep it at a level that's healthy, what would those tips be?
I think a lot of it is very lifestyle related. I think one of the big ones is diet, to check what you eat, and that is such a complex, that's the problem. It's actually so difficult to live a healthy lifestyle because there's so much information out there and there's so much misinformation out there as well. Just the topic of diet alone is extremely complex. But I think a very good rule of thumb is don't eat too much, and also don't be extreme, but processed foods full of preservatives, things that come in packets and you don't know what is in it, it's a very good start to kind of just cut that out. In my life, I try to eat as much fresh fruits and vegetables and food that I know where it's coming from. I think smoking obviously is not great for you, but I don't think I have to elaborate on that because everybody knows that. Drinking as well, there's a lot of research that shows that no amount of alcohol is beneficial for you. I can't make any comments on whether you should not drink at all, or I think
we are in Stellenbosch, so everyone needs to calm down a little bit.
Yeah. Exactly. I think obviously part of it is being happy as well and being like satisfied in your life. So I think you can cut out a bunch of things and be miserable, and then that will also have an effect on your mental health, which in change has an effect on your physical health. But also exactly, and then also stress. That brings me to like stress. And people live very stressful lives and they get used to it, so they don't actually know how stressful the modern lifestyle is and how fast-paced it is.
What do you personally do to manage your stress levels?
I exercise. I spend time, I must say, if I spend time with family and friends, it really keeps me grounded and it brings me back to earth. Just on the topic of alcohol again, I did notice that if I don't drink a lot, then I am less stressed. It really does have an effect on my mental health, and there is a lot of research that shows that it does have an effect on mental health, even moderate amounts or on mood, let me rather say that, moderate amounts of alcohol. I think everyone is different. So for me, I try to drink as little as possible, kind of capping myself on how much information I consume. It's a weird thing, but I think that a lot of us, and me in particular, are very we're addicted to information. Short form, long form. Sorry about this podcast, but I love podcasts because it is long form information, and I think the dopamine hits of scrolling all the time is messing up everyone's brain. But I love taking in information, and sometimes I think it offsets the amount of things I create. And I think it does that for a lot of people. So if I really like creating anything, making food, painting a picture, whatever, it really helps me to relax.
This is also something I struggle with. I love being stimulated. So how do you find the balance between getting enough stimulation and actually just being?
I don't have balance at the moment. I'm going to be completely honest. It's something I'm working on, but I think it's something that I'm consciously working on at the moment. First of all, I try to completely eliminate reels scrolling. So first of all, I cut out useless information because I do feel like it helps me relax my brain, but I think it's at cost of functioning well later. Useless information. I love podcasts, so I allow myself to listen. It feels so weird to say, how do I restrict my information intake? But I love podcasts, so I would listen to podcasts, and I try to focus on one thing at a time. And then I try to consciously output something every day instead of just consuming. So like I said, it could be writing something, just writing a page, or playing some piano. And I also actually socializing, because then you are interacting. It's not just a one-way street. So yeah, I would say those are my strategies, but it's difficult. I can imagine someone like you understands it. It becomes a bit of an addiction.
Maybe just to interject a little bit, there's 2 books that are interesting in what you're talking about. One is called The One Thing, and it kind of looks at managing life by doing one thing. And every day you have one thing to do, and that's exactly what you're saying. It's like emails are coming in, conversations are happening, there's random distraction and admin that you have to do, but what's the one proactive, creative thing that you can do today? Is it write a blog? Is it put this plan together, get this proposal out? One thing each day, and kind of have that be your minimum. maybe even your maximum some days, and have one thing every day and then one theme for the week that you're trying to chase.
Yeah.
So it's always just one thing, and that's manageable. Where if you have a task list of 5 things and you don't get to it today, you don't get to it tomorrow, then you start to feel like, I'm not getting anything done because you're doing 5 things. But if you can just do one thing. In another book, it's a bit older. It's called The R Option, written by a guy, Michael Schluter. He's at the Jubilee Center in either Oxford or Cambridge, one of those. But they do a lot of work in relationships, and they talk about how much more complex our life is from the amount of relationships that we have to manage day to day. Because before, 300 years ago, the next farm was 15 k's away, and you had your family, and then maybe if you wanted to, you could see your neighbor or go to the market once a week. But with the amount of relationships we have to manage now, it raises that stress level because there's emotional expectation on all of us. You have your team members or employees, you have your board, shareholders, you have other partners in business. We're in a co-working space here. There's all these other companies that you're interacting with over coffee or in the kitchen or something. You have people you exercise with, you have friends that you're socializing with. They all want a piece of you. Yeah. Never mind your family that you came from, because now we're adults. And the amount, it makes me stressed thinking about it. Relationships that you have to maintain expectations in is extremely stressful.
That is so true. And I think also the quality of those connections it's not actually as fulfilling as having 3 great friends that you spend all your time with. So I actually told a friend this the other day, I feel like, so I live in Somerset West, but all my friends are scattered. They're all within an hour's drive, and some of them are overseas. But so in my head, I'm like, I have a lot of friends that I can chat to, but our conversations are over WhatsApp, and you have to organize something, and usually it's like once every 2 months because you need to bring everyone together. And then I realized that's the great thing about having a community, a small, close-knit community, because you can never replace that one-on-one connection that you have with people, with all of these like half connections that you maintain over WhatsApp or Zoom.
That has nothing to do with information directly. A lot of indirect information.
Well, I do think that anything lifestyle related and happiness related and health related has indirectly to do with information. So we could technically talk about anything and it will be applicable.
Yeah, I think what I'm also getting from this is try to protect your energy in some shape, way, or form. Yeah. Whether it be professional environment or personal environment. Yeah. There's going to be, I like to think of them as energy vampires. Yeah. So you have to protect yourself from these energy vampires. Exactly. And have systems in place for what that means for you. That's just also what I learned.
Yeah. And I think especially in the startup entrepreneurial space, you will know, you're both very like entrepreneurial and you've been in those spaces, is that it can either be very transactional, all the relationships can be very transactional. I find that very draining. Yeah. Or you can foster, real deep relationships, but it's more difficult in an entrepreneurial environment because it is very transactional at the end of the day.
Back to the business. Yeah. So I want to know what challenges that you face when you transitioned from the masters, getting the go-ahead of now actually running a company with little support.
Yeah. I think first of all, the relationship with failure. I think the failure model that we're taught in school and university is extremely one-dimensional, and it's not how the real world works. So, and if you have a very academic and achiever mindset, then it's difficult to come to terms with the idea of failure. And I think stepping into a startup made me realize very early on that those are the trophies. The failures are the trophies that you put on your wall, because it is, you've learned a lesson. You're not gonna, maybe you're gonna learn it once or twice, but you really need to see failure as an asset and not something that's holding you back.
Tell us about one trophy.
One trophy. I feel like it's micro failures all the time. I try to avoid the major mistakes that will sink a business or sink lives, hashtag Theranos. But I think it's just I would say micro failures in terms of how you manage things, how you build relationships, how you make decisions about what is important, what is not. I think in the beginning, I had to learn how to prioritize, for example. And you only learn that the failure of prioritizing was a failure when you look back on how much time you wasted on certain things. So I can't think of a major one right now that was detrimental, but it was a lot of micro failures. That was extremely important for me to learn. Once again, the thing of you can't do it on your own. And for you to build a good team that will support you, you have to be able to acknowledge the deficiencies in yourself so that you can figure out what are the type of people you need to get on the team. And then you must be able to identify, we need to know people well enough to know what makes them tick and what are their strengths. And I think something or a challenge is to be able to create an environment that you're responsible for in which people can actually grow into their strengths.
And do you have a framework for doing that and finding out what people's strengths are?
I don't think I have a written down framework, but I do. In general, I like knowing how people work, and when I get to know people, I try to get to know them deeply. I feel like it works for me, but to put people in situations where they need to where they have agency over their own actions, where they have to take on quite a bit of responsibility early on, instead of coddling and kind of micromanaging. That's also something I need to learn, is not to micromanage. Throwing someone in the deep end, but giving them floaties so that they don't drown, and then, giving them work that they thrive on.
So you mentioned you're hiring your first employee outside of you and Simone, who are basically founding partners in a way, Anna-Mart and Willy and Resia, research founders, but you and Simone, the practical day-to-day founders, your first employee. What are you doing to not micromanage or not ignore this person? Have you thought about it, or what's happening as this new person starts in the next week or two, or this week?
This week.
How do you make sure they're not micromanaged and you don't just ignore them on day one and you make it useful?
It's a very fine balance. I think we prepped very extensively in terms of what her training is going to be. So she's coming, she's going to do lab work. So there's quite a bit of training that she needs to go through. So in terms of micromanaging the training, make sure everything is coordinated and that she learns the things that she needs to learn. And then creating a space for her to execute with the knowledge that she gained. And I think, obviously daily checkups, things like that, I don't feel that's micromanaging. But I do think creating a space where mistakes are not the end of the world, first of all. Every mistake an employee makes is an investment in them. If you afford them that mistake, it's an investment in them, unless, it's a mistake that kills someone or ends the business.
So the training, high context, here's everything you need to know about Biocode, how we work, what your role is, how we've gotten to this point. And then high autonomy. High context, high autonomy.
I'm going to use that. That's good. And that's exactly what it is, I think. I think in general, we have a culture of high autonomy. And then also autonomy and tolerance.
In terms of your recruitment process, what's that like?
That was extensive. So the reason why we only employed someone now is we've been looking for months. And because it's a startup, you really, the person that you employ has to be able to do things outside of their immediate role. And it's difficult. It was difficult for this specific role to find someone who fits that description. So we actually went through a lot of rounds of interviews, and then each time we were like, wait, maybe this is not the right time to do it now. And I think the business has come to a point where we really do need someone. So we reached out to a woman she was the head of quality control for Ampath. And they're helping us with our quality management at the moment. And we said, we need this. So this person needs to have a very specific qualification, which also, it shrinks the pool of people available. Anyway, so she reached out to her network of people, and we started getting CVs flooding in. And she was the only one that we interviewed from all these CVs, because she was the only one who had a CV who fit the description. And yeah, so we were very, very picky. We actually interviewed her while we were in Switzerland because it was like, we need to get this
That
done.
urgent, yeah.
And I think when we interview, obviously it's about the skill, but what we look for in a deeper sense is the ability to be autonomous and to think critically, because then you're able to say, okay, well, you have this role, but we know that if we give you a job outside of it, you'll be able to do problem solving on it. So I think we really pick according to character, according to critical thinking skills, and according to whether that person will fit into the culture of the company. And I think it's very important for us. The third one is very important because the last thing we want is a toxic work culture. And I think if you don't choose your people very specifically to the culture that you want to cultivate, then things can go south pretty fast.
I think one of the founders that used to be here, Fred Lutz with Kustos, he used the term T-shaped people, and that's what some of what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Like very deep specialist in an area, but lots of interest and ability in other areas. And they also hired in the same way. Kustos is operating still, but Fred's moved on to Voxcroft now. That's part of the Knife Capital portfolio. That's for all the podcast listeners now on where Fred is now. But that was a hiring principle that they made for their first 20-odd people that they hired.
And you have to if you're a startup, because you can't spend, you can't spend a full salary on a person whose time is wasted when they're not doing their very specific job that you employed them for.
Kind of a jack of all trades. I think that's...
Yeah, in a way. You don't want a full generalist, but you want, like, they need to be an engineer, or in this case, a lab technician. They need to understand biology. But if they need to do social media marketing, because there's only 3 people, you're at this event, tweet, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you're doing, like you need to be able to do that and write content in a meaningful way that's relevant to the business. So everyone, like normally in small teams, everyone needs to have access to Twitter, Instagram, whatever people are using now, so that you can do that when there's an opportunity. High context, when there's an opportunity, put something out there on social, as one example.
Thanks for that tip.
Yeah, I use that.
Sorry.
I'm learning a lot.
And speaking about your actual business, could you walk us through what makes up Biocode Technologies and maybe also your products and service offerings?
Yeah, so we started out with the idea of developing an inflammation rapid test for the reasons that I discussed in terms of what inflammation is and why it is important in modern life. We thought we wanted to develop a tool that allows people to measure and track inflammation to see if they're risk cases, or for early detection of people who are risk cases for developing these diseases but don't necessarily know that they have low-grade chronic inflammation and also don't know how to manage it. So we started out with developing this rapid test. It's basically a pregnancy test type of technology, or a COVID rapid test technology. But instead of giving you a yes/no answer, it actually gives you your level of inflammation. It measures an inflammatory marker in the blood, and it's semi-quantitative. And the way we make it semi-quantitative is by developing an image processing machine learning app that can quantify the line intensity that's output on this test.
Semi-quantitative, meaning?
So it's not going to give you to the decimal point the exact concentration of this marker in your blood, but it will give you a kind of a range in which you fall in terms of are you healthy, are you risk case, is this severe type of thing. And I think the technology there is useful in terms of the app, and the image processing technology is also useful for other rapid test applications. It's not just for our biomarker specifically. So we got our funding and our whole idea started with that. And we made a lot of progress in that regard. We also made a lot of mistakes, but I think in the end, when we set our sights on that technology, we actually did very well in executing on it, and we're now going into clinical trials in the beginning of next year. Something that kind of crept in during the COVID phase. Actually, we started in 2020, so the company is a COVID pandemic company. We were involved in some of Resia's research that showed that people who have persistent long COVID after they recovered from COVID have these persisting and major microclots in their blood, circulating in their blood. The technology for that was patented by Stellenbosch University and exclusively licensed to Biocode. So a big part of our operations at the moment is commercializing that technology, which is very interesting and very challenging at the same time, because it's a disease that just, came to fruition, and took a while to be acknowledged. It's a marker that is novel, so people, the general medical field didn't know up until now that it was present in people's blood. And then it's the challenge of standardizing that, validating that, while already using it to help the people who have long COVID now, because they're all very desperate for answers and for help. So that is what most of our time goes into now, is commercializing the micro.
What are the symptoms of long COVID?
So if you recovered from COVID, so if you had COVID, you recovered from COVID, and you have persisting symptoms of fatigue, brain fog, there's a host. People have so many different types of symptoms, but it usually has to do with not being able to function mentally and physically the way that they were before. And it's a lot to do with fatigue and brain fog and heart palpitations, having POTS. And what we discovered, there's a lot that we don't know about the disease yet. But through our research, we showed that there's major clotting and coagulation pathologies in these people. They have these persistent microclots that damage, it's kind of a feedback loop. They have damage in the endothelial layer, so it's the layer that lines your vasculature, but that creates microclots, your blood vessels in your veins. That creates these microclots, but the microclots in turn creates damage. So at the end of the day, your vasculature is just dysfunctioning, and there's not enough oxygen exchange between your blood and your tissue. So people have a host of symptoms that seem like they have nothing to do with each other, but at the end of the day, there's this common factor where they're not actually getting enough oxygen to their tissue. There's a lot of other factors as well. The long COVID research community is there's a lot of debate on what's the cause of long COVID, or the root cause, but the microclots have been a big part of helping people so far. Yeah.
And just in terms of your rapid testing, so could you maybe explain how the process works for the layman?
Okay, so the rapid test is separate from the long COVID stuff. It's an inflammation rapid test. It's something that we want people to be able to buy it off the shelf, or for integrative medicine practitioners or doctors, if they would like to use it to have in their practice. It's a finger prick test. So you get a kit. You pick your finger, so you get a lancet with it. Same process of testing yourself, your glucose levels. Get a finger prick test. You put your blood sample on the test. The test runs for about 15 minutes, and then you scan the test with the app. And then the app outputs the results for you.
Sorry, on a mobile device?
Yes.
So there's a bit of computer vision that is measuring that intensity of the line that gives you a range of a reading.
Yes, exactly.
Very cool.
That is it. And in terms of the development, is that what you asked?
Yeah, off this app, this is incredible.
Yeah. So we started out by finding a team in Cape Town who does rapid test development as contract work. They've been amazing. It's Lateral Flow Labs. So we went to them, said we wanted a rapid test, but we need to kind of work with them long term for it to be semi-quantitative. So most of the rapid tests for HIV, and they're actually doing one. I don't want to say what they're doing. I don't know how much of it is confidential, but it's yes, no. And that's fairly, the technology for that is fairly sorted out. It's pretty easy to develop that. Easy, for the people who know what they're doing.
You have HIV or you don't. You're pregnant or you're not. You're not halfway pregnant.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And then we worked with them to figure out how to develop this test that works in the same principle and uses the same technology, because it's very readily available and known technology, but to make it semi-quantitative. So we worked with them and their team, and then we worked with at that time, our tech partners, Octaco, to start with the initial software development for the image processing. That process was also, I learned a lot in that process, because you're working with two different things. You're working with the rapid test that you have to optimize and the image processing that you have to optimize. And you kind of can't optimize the one without the other, but you also first have to optimize the rapid test before you optimize the image processing. So it was was a fine balance in terms of what you spend time on and what you spend money on. But we eventually got to the point where we were happy with the performance, and also we got some people to go further with the image processing, and I'm very happy with where it's at now. So it's it's very chemical, a chemical process, well, not chemical, but the whole, it's biochemistry, putting the test together and making that work as the test unit. But then it's also very technical in terms of the image processing, and how the big challenge with image processing is you obviously wanted to work on many types of devices. And you have a few issues, how are you going to make it work on different phones that have different processing methods to process the images? So the color information in the images are different from phone to phone. Also different light conditions, and a lot of other variables. So that was our challenge, was to figure out how to solve those problems with the software.
So there's a lot of moving parts. You have biochemistry, you have some hardware, just like plastic. You have other biotech enzymes and things that are coming into that. And so Octaco, you mentioned, it's former Launch Lab, other company founders that are now running that. Have there been, just in the community here, like what other companies are kind of supplying you or you're partnering with as you develop this that are kind of in the same realm? Because there's a lot of, I'm hearing overlaps. Maybe it's only Octaco, but are there others kind of overlapping that it's like quite symbiotic to be in the same space? You're in the cafe talking about what you're doing. Oh, well, we can provide that enzyme or something like that.
I don't know really of other people in this space who do rapid test development in the way that we do.
Yeah.
Just to answer your question, who the peripheral players are, the lateral flow labs does a lot of the curation for all the procurement for all of the reagents and materials. So they have a whole ISO accredited process to vet people or suppliers, and those suppliers are mostly overseas. I'm not exactly sure who they are. That's part of lateral flow labs' process. Yes, like you said, in terms of getting the cassette right, we work with a company in Cape Town who does the injection molding for the cassettes. But then on the cassettes, there's laser printing, and that's a big. If anybody's listening to this podcast and they know of someone in South Africa who does very good laser printing on plastic, yes, hit me up, because that's challenging, and there are people who do it, but I'm not going to go into detail, but basically it depends on what type of plastic you're using, whether the laser printing is going to work or not. So that's the whole different moving part. There's the technical part, the software development, hosting all of that software and making sure that it's maintained and that it's actually viable for commercial use. Regulatory stuff. I would say regulatory stuff is it's a big theme in the medtech and biotech space. I don't know if it's the same for all of the different types of. You can do so many things in medtech and biotech, but I think there are some helpful regulatory experts. That's something that could be shared between everyone in the space. I feel like the medtech biotech space is growing in the Western Cape, but a lot of it is more biotech than medtech.
And in terms of the stage of business that you're at, so you said that it's going to be clinical trials soon for the rapid testing. So what was before that? And maybe could you walk us through the timeline?
So obviously, to test your rapid test and see if it works, you need some kind of sample to run to monitor it. Or to test it. So we went through a whole process of finding out what is the best, we call it the matrix or the best material sample to run on our test and artificially spike so that we get a range of concentrations with which we can validate the test. That was a whole process of getting the right matrix for that before we can go to actual finger prick blood. Lateral Flow Labs obviously has their own process of developing the tests. They use artificial matrices, or they use real blood as well that you spin down. So they use serum or platelet plasma, and they have their own development processes to basically get the test to a point where you can validate it. Our next step is to, obviously we have validated with blood, but our next step is to validate it in a setting where people are actually using it the way that it should be used, with a finger prick, with all of the peripheral components, because everything is very controlled right now. When we do validation tests, we control, everything to the T. We use micropipettes. We use a very specific type of matrix. We make sure we have a very specific calibration curve. So this next part is to validate it in that real world scenario.
I'm just trying to give an overview of the business. So validation, next stage, and how are you tackling the Biocode technology and then
the microclots?
So how are you kind of like managing?
Obviously the thing that brings in money gets the most priority at the moment. So we do spend most of our time working on most of our personal time we spend working on the microclots and commercializing that, because that ball is rolling quite fast. But that doesn't mean we're not spending time on the rapid test, but we have people outside of the company helping with the development. So for the rapid test, it's more about managing those people so that they do the development correctly, and then we do a lot of the testing ourselves, but in terms of the development of the software and the test itself, we have people doing that for us. So there's a lot of time where they're doing their job and we can focus on the microclots. The microclots that takes up a lot of our time, because it's a product that can already be used, or it's a service that can already be used in a very controlled environment. And our bottleneck for that at the moment is validating and standardizing it so that it can be used without the closed loop context that we're using it at the moment. And we spend all of our resources and time now on that, because it's extremely important for us that this technology is readily available out there, because there's so many people who need it. And it's not going to be readily available if it's not extremely standardized, because it's almost unprecedented for any new novel diagnostic for a kind of a new unknown disease to hit the market and be readily available within like such a short amount of time. Usually it takes years, sometimes decades, for new technology to become standard clinical practice.
Was there any, like the normal healthcare regulatory environment's quite long to get anything to market, but were there special cases because of state of disaster, emergency, or whatever we were under, that prioritized everything COVID related? Was that?
Yeah.
Often there's a bit of luck and timing in the startup world, and you guys had so much technology relevant there, and then COVID was, it was a terrible worldwide disaster, but it can fast track. It reduces the regulatory time to get something to market to solve a global pandemic.
Yep. There was definitely some, SAHPRA.
Yeah.
South African Health. What is
that thing?
That
SAHPRA.
thing. Well, they regulate medical devices and things like that. They actually basically fast track. They became much more efficient during the COVID pandemic, because they fast tracked all medical devices and technologies that had to do with treating COVID specifically. So I won't say that we could necessarily jump on that train for long COVID, because long COVID is a bit of it's not as widely accepted as an issue yet as COVID was, obviously. But I would say the thing with long COVID and with fast tracking technology in the long COVID space is research around the long COVID is extremely patient driven, because there is such a large community of people out there that are suffering, and because during the early stages of long COVID, doctors didn't believe patients because there are no other clinical markers to show that there's something wrong with these people. So basically, a lot of doctors and people, and still some do, say that it's completely psychosomatic. It's all, mental health. Well, that is not the case. We have seen that. But it was extremely patient-driven. So, some doctors and researchers who have long COVID themselves became the drivers for innovation, for research. And that allowed us in Resia, specifically through her research, to very, very quickly collaborate with people all over the world who could validate that what we're seeing is what they're seeing and that this is an issue. And this created a very large long COVID research community. And I think within that community, it becomes easier to push for certain technologies to come to the market earlier.
But when you're getting international lobbying and it's escalating it to a level that it creates a global industry, not just a one-off little thing.
Yeah, and we're already sub-licensing to international companies, which makes it great because they are responsible for validating on their side. So we get license fees, obviously, if they commercialize, but we also it's almost a collaborative effort in commercial or in standardizing globally.
Very cool.
Is that your strategy for the business side of things?
Yeah, I think for the long COVID or the microclot testing, the strategy is in South Africa, obviously we want to capture the market at the end of the day. But we also want to start planting seeds internationally. So for now, our strategy has been to sub-license to people who are willing to take that torch and run with it overseas. But our next strategy is to validate and standardize in such a way that it's not just the people at the early adopters, people at the forefront who make it happen. It's the whole world that trusts in it and understands it and wants to use it, not only for long COVID, but for other vascular issues. So it started with long COVID, but the technology for detecting these microclots existed before long COVID. Resia actually I did my master's on it as well, on the detection of these microclots in other inflammatory diseases. It's to much lesser extent than in long COVID, but it's still present and it's part of the whole inflammatory process in these other diseases. So the idea is that it starts out with long COVID and long COVID being the driver, but then we want to standardize it to a point where it's not about are we diagnosing long COVID or COVID, or long COVID or not. It's about what is a healthy range of microclots and do you have microclots or not? That's the diagnosis. So do you have abnormal amounts of microclots? And that is applicable to more than just long COVID.
So it sounds like the microclotting rapid tests are a good bridge into...
The microclotting is not a rapid test yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lab test. It's basically the type of test that Pathcare or Ampath does, and it requires at this point very expensive equipment.
Hence the licensing.
Yeah.
So then that as a commercial entity, licensing it to other companies in Switzerland, and you guys were just on a trip. That's a interesting commercial distribution strategy to get a product out that had kind of low barriers to entry to get it into the market. That's very unique and novel. Where now, as you develop the inflammatory biomarker, more that kind of test, which is what we started with, now you're building these connections internationally to have those bridges in other places. You're becoming known in this industry, and then when that product's ready, then you have all these connections already. Yeah.
That is, at the end of the day, that's the bigger picture idea. And for the microclot testing, it starts out with very expensive equipment, which we need to create a gold standard. We need something that's very quantitative and that could be the gold standard. But then, going forward, the idea is to make it more readily available, make it more affordable. But to develop anything from here that's like maybe a rapid test, maybe a device, maybe standardizing it on a different machine that's less expensive, we need to have some kind of gold standard to validate it against. So that is our big priority at the moment.
Awesome.
From a funding point of view, I saw that you guys recently received an additional grant from the UTF. Is that correct?
Yes, but that was actually part of our Series A funding. So we
Gotcha.
received our Series A funding in 2 tranches.
Okay.
And that was the second tranche.
Yeah,
that
not a
we
grant.
received.
That was for equity.
Yeah.
Oh, my
Yeah.
mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
They're expecting return.
yes, they are. So yeah, we got our first tranche in 2022, I think, or 2021. Yeah, 2021, and then our second tranche now, the beginning of the year. Well, it's the end of the year, so it's not now.
Yeah.
Almost a year ago. Yeah.
And in terms of expectations on return, what's the timeline?
Well, the UTF has a 10-year lifetime, so I assume they expect returns before then. I do not know what their internal strategies are, but we are going to try and grow the business as fast as possible within the next, let's say our internal timelines are next 2 to 3 years. We want to be at a place where the UTF is happy with their returns.
Before we started shooting, we started speaking about Theranos.
Oh, yay.
So I have a few questions around this.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on, just a high-level view, on what went wrong?
I think it started out as a woman who wanted to be a Silicon Valley multi-billion-dollar company founder. I think her drive and her personality kind of enticed people to become a part of that dream. I think what went wrong is I think she was not able to let go of the idea that she created of herself and of the company. And she was able, well, I guess the core team was able to keep a lot of what was going on from the rest of the team. And I think that was the perfect combination to create a company in which reality is completely distorted and people have a lot to lose. And it's worse to keep going and make it work than give it all up and damage reputations and go to prison. So, yeah, I think it was a perfect storm of psychology and risk and ego.
And raising over $700 million in capital. My question is, how is she still not able to find the solution?
That is a good question. I think it's very, very tricky. What she was trying to do was extremely tricky. I do not know what the internal conversations and the technology development looked like. But it was obviously way harder than it seemed. Otherwise, these people would have made something work. I wonder whether she couldn't let go of the grand idea. I think her initial idea was extremely grand and extremely challenging. And I think she thought that if I throw enough money at it and I, get people on board that really know what's going on, then we'll make it work. Well, I think maybe she should have started with something. She should have had a timeline, and started with something that was more manageable and more realistic, and then worked her way up. But I don't think that's what sells in Silicon Valley. I don't think being like, we have this big dream, but we're going to start with this little thing is what drives
you
the
mentioned
funding.
$700 million and eventually had a $9 billion valuation.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about you getting a tranche of 7 million rand into Biocode. We're playing in the same world relatively.
Yeah.
But there's probably a lesson of when you raise capital, you have to make the capital work. And normally you need to make it work in a short amount of time. You don't raise it and spend it over 5 years. You raise it and you spend it fairly quickly because that's the expectation. You need it now. You don't put it in the bank and sit on it for 5 years. So you raise money and you have to make it work and spend it and bring in contractors and consultants to do things or buy inventory, buy plastic and laser cut things or whatever. So then it creates complexity for a CEO to understand, I need money.
Yeah.
I can't sit on it. I need to make it work. What's the right number that I need to accomplish what we need to? And I think the 7 million rand, deploying that well, being a steward of that, you'll get to 70 million rand and 700 million rand when it's the right time. But like little bits that make the responsibility meet where the business actually is.
Yeah.
So yeah, well done only taking 7 million.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was also an internal conflict, is that the examples are examples of Silicon Valley tech companies who raise $70 million or more. Like,
Yeah.
it's
In that, so you see these things in the media, and investors read that, our local ones, international ones, and everything. Did you have any conflict? Obviously, the UTF is different because they understand the actual space. But did you have any conversations with investors like, why are you only raising $7 million? Why aren't you raising $700 million? And like a bit of a view of, you don't need enough money, or...
Yeah, definitely. It wasn't conversations with investors. It was more just in general, the sentiment that we got from a few people was like, well, you're not thinking big enough. And I mean, maybe in the future we'll look back and be like, we should have raised more money. But also, I know for a fact that at the time of raising the money, I would not have known what to do with hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, I don't think someone like Elizabeth Holmes knew, and the team knew what to do with that amount of money. So I think that it's so, like you said, you have to make it work for you. But if you're not sure how to make it work for you, then you're just going to waste it. So I think our strategy was like, we know what our limitations are. We know what we don't know yet. So let's take the 7 million, build value in the company, learn the lessons that we need to learn. And when we get to a point where we're like, we know what we'll do with 100 million rand, then we raise it.
Yeah. Something I also question is, why buy the building? Why put your name on the building? Why buy all the fancy things, throw all these extravagant parties on investors' money? Why not build yourself up to the point where you become profitable and then do those things? I think that's what I kind of question.
And I think that is the internal conflict, is the discrepancy between what you see people are doing and then, you see, okay, that's the model of success. But what logically makes sense to me is exactly what you described now. I think it's all about building value in the company. I think having a building and, taking people out for fancy dinners, it builds value in terms of what your image is. And I don't think that's a small thing. I think, what people think of you is also important if you're a business. But I think it gets to a point where if there's a big discrepancy between what the outside world thinks of you and what's actually going on in your business, then you are in a very dangerous space. So I think our company often gives up kind of projecting outwards and creating an image and building a brand before we're happy with the value that we created in the company.
You also have to, when you receive funding has specific allocations. Revenue and income and profit does not necessarily. If I give you money and you tell me you're going to spend it on 1, 2, 3, you better spend it on 1, 2, 3. But if you get revenue in, it's not attached to funding. There's a budget that you put forward to the board and they approve that. And then some of that's fungible. You're always under governance. Investor wants you to spend it on this. The board approves a budget. But that's a lot more free and autonomous. You can buy a private plane if you want to. You can buy a building if it's profit, like income-driven revenue for value. Funding is not value-driven cash flow. It has very specific targets. And it's dangerous when you start. A lot of founders mix the two. I raise funding. I can spend it on whatever I want to because they gave me the money. Yeah, I gave them a plan, but that's just to get the money. We're still going to spend it on what we want to. That happens more often than I think we want to believe.
No, I agree. I think also if you're going to raise money, you have to be able to prove the value that you created in your company if you don't want to, sell off your whole company for a small amount. So I think our strategy has been, we're very conservative with our expenses. We hyper prioritize. And our main goal is to create enough value in the company so that when we go out and raise more money, which I think we will do in the future, that we first of all know what we're going to use it for. And second of all, we know that it's going to help the company grow. So it's going to help us grow in a way that our current revenue won't. And we know that we're not going to sell our whole company for pittance because we actually did create some value in the company with the 7 million that we had.
Maybe you as a CEO, a little bit focus on you again. So 3 years, Yeah, about 3 years, more than 3 years now.
Yeah.
How have you're a bit more introspective than most engineers. How have you seen yourself change?
Maybe I'm just a little bit more talkative than most engineers.
Have you seen yourself change and grow? And maybe after that, in the next year or season, what gaps do you see that you have that you're like, I need support for this thing or that thing? Or yeah.
I found a balance between realism and optimism. I think when you build a company, it's very important to be realistic. But I mean, one of the multiple possible outcomes, is going to include a positive outcome as well. So I think you can be realistic and optimistic at the same time. And that is something that I also learned from my team members as well. I used to be very focused on, all the factors that could influence this not working. And then my strategy would be to mitigate that. I had the strategy of, if I know what all the problems are, then I can solve them, which I think is good. But I think you have to consciously remind yourself that there is a possibility that this will work, and focus on what you need to do to make it work, not what you need to do to keep it from not working.
Very slight nuance there, but that's a big impact to get that right thinking.
It is, especially if you are wired a certain way.
Yeah.
I think also coming from academic environment, studying engineering, there's not a lot of gray area in terms of how to make things work. Like either it works or it doesn't work, or this is how physics work, or this is not how physics works. You pass or you fail. But I think in business, there's so many different scenarios, and you won't know which the right one is until you start doing things. So I think I also learned how to prioritize the right things, take the right steps to execute in such a way that I don't sink the whole situation, but that I can look back and be like, okay, it makes sense that it played out like this. Yeah. And there wasn't one right way to do it. Yeah. I think that's a big one, is I always thought that the world worked in a certain way, and that there were people out there who knew exactly how it worked. And I needed to learn what that is. I needed to learn how the world spins. And then through this process, I realized that most people are also just figuring it out. Yeah. And
everyone's making up everything.
Everyone's making up everything. And that's such a great thing to realize, because then you realize, well, you also have an opportunity to make something up. Yeah. And maybe that thing that you made up is better than the thing that already existed. So that was one of the very cool things that I got out of this experience.
Awesome. Spoken like a true optimist.
Yeah. yeah. Well, you have to be optimistic, otherwise you're gonna give up. It's too hard to build a business while you're pessimistic.
And further, you're a CEO still. It's not just the last 3 or 4 years. You're moving
what I need
into
to do now.
What you've solved some things, you've removed some blind spots.
I think what I need to do now, what I think I will learn within the next few years, is how to manage a larger team. We've been small and we've been conservative and compact and lean up until now. And it allows me to, trust on the people around me, that they know what they're doing. I think learning whether I am able to do that, I think I am, but you won't know until you have to manage 20 people, 10 to 20 people, and then more. Yeah.
And then do you want to?
I think so. I'll find out once I do it. Like I said, I'm learning a lot about myself as I go along, but I do think the challenge will be for me is that I get very involved in a person's life. And I start to care about who they are as a person, what their personal struggles are. And I think you need to set up boundaries in terms of that. I think it's good to have good relationships with employees and the people you manage, but I think there has to be some kind of boundary as well. Otherwise, it will be completely taxing. I shouldn't ask you guys to do that. So we'll see. If I'm excited about it, I think I want to work with more people. I think I will learn more about my strengths in that regard. But I think it will be challenging for my personality as well.
That's an interesting answer. And you didn't chase transaction sales, you didn't chase technology, You
True.
went down the leadership vein, which is not right or wrong,
Yeah.
but I think it's an interesting answer that you gave. When you're an engineer, you could have answered engineering, or you're also driving biz dev. You could have answered partnership, sales, whatever. You answered team.
But you know what? It's actually part of the bigger theme, which I'm referring to, is working with people.
Yeah.
I think business development, and I've done quite a bit of that in terms of clients and people who do work for us outside the team. So I've got an experience in terms of doing deals, even though it's limited, but doing deals and managing people outside who know what they're doing. You can trust them with the job.
Yeah.
But it's different when you're managing a lot of people inside the company. But in the greater scheme of things, for me, it's about really learning how people tick and how you can bring people together to create a well-oiled machine. Yeah. That's very interesting to me.
Acknowledging that is already a win, because there's a lot of academic founders that just they treat their employees the same way they treat their outside consultants and contractors, and you cannot.
No.
And you're already thinking in that way. Yeah.
Any final thoughts and advice on entrepreneurs wanting to pivot from academia to business?
I think the two fields are extremely different. And the transition is something very important to realize when you're making that transition is the currency, like the metaphorical currency in those two spaces are very different. In the academic field, it's about getting grants to do research and publishing papers. Your output is papers, your currency is papers in terms of measuring success. It can become a very individualistic process. I think when you transition into a business space, then obviously your currency is money and revenue and whether, the impact that your product has and whether it sells. But also working in a team becomes extremely important. So it's rewiring your brain in terms of who are you as an individual in this bigger space. It's not about your research and your papers. I mean, there's a lot of collaboration in the academic space, but that was kind of my transition. And start focusing on how am I going to make money, how I'm going to drive revenue, not how am I going to create this cool technology, and then we'll figure out later whether people want to buy it or not.
Este, thank you.
Yeah,
thanks,
you. Este.
This was very fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was very valuable. Yeah. I definitely learned a lot.
Eye-opening.
I learned a lot as well. You guys made me dig deep.
This is Brandon's podcast.
Thank you so
thank you.
much,
Thank
guys.
you also for the impact that you're making. Not only in South Africa and Africa, but globally. So
you too. I hope this podcast blows up.
It will.
It
I
already
think that too. I like that attitude.